Welcome, chosen ones. You didn't just stumble upon this word, you were summoned to it. This isn't casual content. This is a divine revelation, an official reminder from the courts of heaven that you were never average. You were always covered, called, and carrying something sacred. And now, the verdict is in. The spiritual warfare you endured wasn't a random attack. It was an unprovoked attempt to challenge someone whose rank had already been sealed in eternity. And whether they knew it or not, when they tried to play games with you, they didn't just provoke a reaction, they activated a judgment. Let me say this clearly, never pick a spiritual fight with someone heaven already backs, especially when you have no idea who you're swinging at. Some people thought they were gossiping about a soft soul or manipulating someone passive. They didn't realize they were contending with a general in the spirit realm, cloaked in silence and humility. But heaven knew. And now, so does hell. Because what they assumed was weakness was actually divine restraint. And what they mistook for simplicity was strategic concealment. Isn't it always the same? Those who think they're in control get too bold, too loud, until the consequences crash down and it's too late to take it back. Here's a chilling truth that spans ancient spiritual wisdom, from the Tibetan monks to African mystics to early Christian prophets and indigenous tribes. The highest-ranking spiritual beings are rarely loud, flamboyant, or flashy. They move in simplicity. They move in silence. They move like you. Why? Because only the humble will discern their power, and only the arrogant will expose themselves by attempting to dominate what they can't comprehend. It's the cosmic safeguard. It's why God allowed you to appear ordinary, so you could rise without sabotage, until someone dared to violate what was never theirs to touch. And that's exactly what happened to you, isn't it? They thought you were just a kind person, just a nice one, maybe a little too deep, maybe too spiritual, maybe even weird. You know, the usual names they call chosen ones when they can't decode your frequency. What they didn't understand is that you weren't simply deep, you were encrypted. Every time they mocked your peace, downplayed your discernment, or questioned your silence, they were actually coming up against a divine firewall. And this firewall doesn't just protect, it punishes. It reroutes the attacks, it reroutes the consequences, and now they're reaping confusion, chaos, and inner torment they can't explain. All because they mishandled someone marked by the Most High. Let's be honest, have you noticed the shift? The same ones who said, "You're not that deep," are the ones now dreaming about you, stumbling in life, haunted by spiritual backlash they don't understand. That's not coincidence. That's divine cause and effect. That's what happens when you trespass into sacred territory thinking it's unguarded. You weren't unguarded. You were divinely sealed. Before we go deeper, I want to take a moment to sincerely thank every single one of you who has supported this space through the super thanks. Your generosity doesn't go unnoticed. It fuels this mission to speak truth to the chosen, to light the way for those who've been walking through hidden fire. But whether you donate or not, hear me, I'm deeply grateful for your time, your presence, and your spirit. Just showing up here matters. You matter. If this message is already resonating in your soul, do something prophetic. Drop 777 in the comments as a sign of agreement and divine alignment. That number represents spiritual completion, heavenly perfection, and the manifestation of judgment in favor of the righteous. Let that be your seal in this moment. You are not who they thought you were, and they are not ready for the truth heaven is about to reveal. Because this isn't just another spiritual pep talk. This is a courtroom deposition in the realm of the spirit. This is divine exposure. This is evidence of protection. And by the time this message ends, you'll understand fully why the ones who underestimated you are now living through the aftermath of touching something sacred, something sent, something chosen. Are you ready? Because it's not just your name on the line, it's your assignment, and heaven is defending it. God's chosen ones, they thought you were average until heaven responded. Number 1, they mistook humility for powerlessness until they encountered the weight of your unspoken authority. Chosen one, how many times have people mistaken your quiet nature for weakness? How often did they look at your silence and assume it meant surrender? They thought that because you didn't raise your voice, you didn't carry one. They assumed that because you didn't retaliate, you had nothing in you worth fearing. But let's pause here. Have you ever seen a lion roar before it strikes? Or does it often walk in silence, knowing its strength is never in question? That's you. They couldn't interpret the stillness in your spirit because they had never met someone with spiritual discipline. What they saw as powerlessness was actually restraint, a divine restraint birthed from identity, not insecurity. They expected you to clap back, to argue, to defend yourself in the way they were used to. But you didn't, and that's what shook them. You didn't need to expose them, because exposure wasn't your job, it was heaven's. You didn't lower yourself to their level, because you were never standing on the same ground to begin with. They thought your silence was weakness, but in reality, it was sacred strategy. You weren't quiet because you had no comeback. You were quiet because your calling made noise without needing volume. Your presence disrupted their spirits, not because you tried to, but because it carries a frequency they couldn't handle. Think of how Jesus stood silent before Pilate. The crowd screamed, the accusations flew, and he said nothing. Why? Because his authority didn't need performance. As Isaiah 53:7 declares, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. That's the kind of quiet you walked in. It wasn't fear, it was divine composure, and that composure spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. They mistook your humility for helplessness. They assumed that since you didn't flex, you had no muscle. Since you didn't post or boast, you had no glory. But they forgot. Some of the most anointed vessels don't announce their fire. They carry it in their silence. Real authority doesn't have to parade itself. It just shows up and shifts the atmosphere. Consider Nelson Mandela. Locked in prison for 27 years, he didn't scream revenge. He waited. He endured. And when the world finally saw what he had endured with dignity, he emerged not as a victim, but as a global leader. Or think of Rosa Parks, a quiet woman on a bus, but her stillness started a movement. She didn't need to shout. Her silence, her refusal to move, was power made manifest. And what about Keanu Reeves, a Hollywood star known for his humility and quiet generosity? He doesn't need to boast about his actions. The fruit of his character speaks for him. And then there's Mr. Rogers. His quiet strength built a generation. No drama, no flash, just kindness, truth, and consistency. And the world still reveres him for it. Can you see the pattern? Have you realized yet that your silence was never weakness? It was weight. It was the discipline of someone who has walked with God long enough to know not every attack deserves your energy. So when they kept poking, prodding, provoking, what happened? That's when things started to shift. They began to feel uneasy. Plans that once succeeded began to crumble. People that once stood with them started stepping back, and the peace they once felt, gone. Replaced with restless dreams, unexplained tension, and an invisible pressure they couldn't name. Because the moment they crossed that spiritual line, something divine responded. What if the universe didn't need your voice because your energy had already spoken judgment? Psalm 18:39 reminds us, You armed me with strength for battle. You humbled my adversaries before me. You didn't have to lift a sword. Your anointing did the work. And now they're haunted, not by your retaliation, but by the realization that you were never to be messed with in the first place. They expected a petty fight, but what they got was a spiritual reminder that some people are not just protected, they are backed by unseen forces. That's what scared them. Not your words, but your ranking. Not your reaction, but your restraint. Not your retaliation, but your divine alignment. So now they finally see, but it cost them everything. And maybe you've wondered, should I have said more? But chosen one, your silence said everything. As Proverbs 17:27 says, the one who has knowledge uses words with restraint, and whoever has understanding is even-tempered. That's the wisdom you carried, and that's why they lost a battle you never had to fight. Number 2, they thought they were coming for you, until they realized they declared war on heaven itself. Chosen one, do you know what truly frightened them? It wasn't your words, it wasn't your actions, it was the realization, too late, that you weren't standing alone, that when they spoke against you, schemed behind your back, and treated your presence lightly, they weren't just dealing with a person, they were challenging a divine realm that you represent. They didn't just gossip, they triggered warfare. But spiritual warfare doesn't always sound like thunder. It often begins with whispers they thought were harmless. Have you ever wondered why the backlash they received seemed so disproportionate to what they thought they did? That's because they didn't realize who you are. You don't just walk through this world carrying a name, you carry a calling. You don't just exist with personality, you exist on assignment. And when someone tries to harm a divine assignment, they're not merely offending you, they're offending the God who sent you. What happens when people casually mock something sacred, thinking it's ordinary? What happens when they try to dismantle a vessel, not knowing it was carved by God's own hand? The answer is always the same: divine backlash. And it's not revenge. It's not you seeking payback. It's heaven restoring order. Romans 12:19 tells us plainly, do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. And when heaven repays, it does so with perfect justice, not pettiness. Let's be honest, chosen one, they underestimated your spiritual identity. They thought you were just someone with self-control and patience. But what they didn't see was that every step you took was ordained. Every silence you kept was strategic. You weren't just being nice, you were standing in spiritual formation. You were guarding sacred ground. They didn't see the mantle over your life, but that didn't mean it wasn't there. And because they couldn't see it, they disrespected it. But the spiritual realm you carry doesn't need to be seen to be felt. It only needs to be violated once for it to respond. Look at the story of David and Saul. Saul kept attacking David, chasing him, trying to kill him. But every time David restrained himself, heaven responded. Eventually, Saul fell, not by David's sword, but by the judgment of the Lord. That's what happens when people touch what's anointed. Psalm 105 verse 15 declares it boldly, do not touch my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm. You didn't have to lift a finger. The realm you represent did the lifting for you. They thought they were picking on a person, but in truth they were picking on a prophetic force. And prophetic forces don't answer to petty accusations. They answer to heaven's timing, and when heaven moves, it doesn't need your permission. It moves on behalf of justice. Have you noticed how quickly things started falling apart in their world the moment they attacked you? Did you feel the shift, even though you said nothing? That wasn't coincidence. That was spiritual reaction. That was the realm you walk in, responding with correction. Because the realm of God doesn't tolerate mockery, not when it concerns someone he's commissioned. Think of Malala Yousafzai, the young girl who was shot simply for advocating for education. Her attackers thought they were silencing a voice. What they didn't realize was they were provoking a global movement. Malala survived, and her voice became louder than ever. Or remember Joan of Arc, a teenage girl who believed she was sent by God to save France. People mocked her, leaders doubted her, but she walked in obedience, and armies followed her into battle. Her conviction made kings tremble. Or even Martin Luther King Jr. He wasn't just delivering speeches. He was speaking divine assignments into a broken system. People targeted him, thinking they were targeting a man. But what they struck was a calling, and the echo of that calling still shapes history. And what about Harriet Tubman? She wasn't just freeing slaves, she was moving under divine direction. Those who opposed her weren't fighting a woman, they were fighting the justice of heaven, and they lost. So when your enemies came for you, chosen one, they weren't just playing petty games, they were provoking divine resistance. That's why things began to fall apart around them. That's why relationships turned sour. That's why opportunities began drying up. Because the spiritual consequences of touching what is sacred cannot be undone with apologies or denial. 1 Corinthians 3:17 warns, "If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple." You are sacred. Your life is sacred. Your calling is not up for negotiation. And anyone who comes against you unknowingly invokes that level of divine seriousness. You didn't curse them. You didn't even react. But the realm did. Because it had to. And not to protect your ego, but to uphold divine protocol. Because the moment someone tries to dismantle a divine blueprint, judgment follows. Not as punishment, but as divine alignment. So, chosen one, don't mistake their downfall as karma. It's confirmation. Confirmation that you're not just here, you were sent. You're not just gifted, you're assigned. And the realm you walk in will always respond when someone tries to dismantle what God established. They thought they were picking on someone average, but what they didn't realize is that you were never meant to be explained. You were meant to be protected. Number 3, your spirit holds clearance they will never earn, and that terrifies them. Chosen one, do you realize just how rare you are? Not because of your accomplishments, not because of your personality, but because of the clearance God placed on your soul before you ever took your first breath. What does it mean to be spiritually cleared for access others can't even dream of? It means you walk through dimensions in prayer that others can't even enter with performance. It means heaven listens when you whisper. And yes, it means when people try to mess with you, they activate consequences far beyond their comprehension. They saw your humility and mistook it for spiritual infancy. They saw your silence and assumed you had nothing to say. But what they didn't understand is that there are levels to this. There's weight in your presence. There are rooms in the spirit that you've been granted access to, not because you were popular or pleasing, but because you were processed. You've been through fire, you've walked through betrayals, dark nights, loneliness, and still came out with your faith intact. That's what gave you clearance. Not applause, but survival. Let's reflect for a moment. How could they possibly understand the cost of your calling when they've never paid the price for presence? Your spiritual rank was given to you through scars, not selfies. It was formed in secret, not platforms. The enemy trembles not because of what you say, but because of the doors that open around you without explanation. Doors of favor, of insight, of divine alignment. And those who tried to infiltrate your space using jealousy, control, or manipulation, they weren't just rude, they were trespassing. This isn't about elitism, It's not about thinking you're better than anyone else. It's about divine authorization. You were approved by heaven to carry out assignments others will never even understand. Just like Queen Esther, who was given divine access for such a time as this. Esther 4:14. You too walk with an invisible crown. The enemy doesn't fear your volume, he fears your permission. You were cleared for realms they will never be allowed to enter. Consider the life of Maya Angelou. She wasn't just a poet, she was a voice ordained by God. Her words carried spiritual weight because they were forged in pain and truth. She had access not because of charm, but because of calling. Or think of Desmond Doss, a quiet medic who saved 75 men in World War II without firing a weapon. He wasn't flashy, he was faithful. His authority came from his conviction. And then there's Oprah Winfrey, dismissed in her youth, rejected, mocked, but her favor and spiritual sensitivity gave her influence that even her enemies couldn't explain. They didn't understand how a girl from Mississippi could command global rooms. That's what clearance looks like. So when people tested you, tried to dominate you or provoke you, what happened next? Suddenly, their world shifted. Dreams became disturbed, relationships collapsed, confusion multiplied. It wasn't karma, it wasn't coincidence. It was spiritual backlash from entering space they were never cleared for. Psalm 91:1 puts it plainly, He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. You don't just visit sacred ground, you live there. And that's why they couldn't figure you out, because your life is coded in spirit, not ego. And now, they are haunted by your calm, tormented by your composure. Why didn't you explode? Why didn't you break? That was your clearance showing. Because when you carry heaven's access, you don't have to react. You just keep walking. And heaven does the rest. They didn't realize you don't just pray, you legislate. You don't just survive, you shift atmospheres. Let this sink in, chosen one. Your name carries weight in rooms your feet haven't even stepped into. That's the power of divine backing. That's the signature of spiritual rank. And those who once doubted it, they now whisper about you in awe, realizing too late that you weren't just someone. They were speaking against a vessel heaven authorized. Number 4, they mocked the vessel because they couldn't discern the rank in the spirit. They judged you by appearance. They decided you were common because you didn't come in robes, rings, and reputation. They looked at your clothes, your background, your tone, and dismissed you. But how can temporary eyes measure eternal purpose? That's the problem. They used earthly logic to judge spiritual authority. They laughed at what they could see and completely missed what they could never understand. You didn't come to impress. You didn't come to entertain. You didn't come to play a part in their performative religion or fake social hierarchy. You were sent to disrupt. You were sent as an interruption to the deception they were living in. But they couldn't recognize you because they weren't trained to see in the spirit. Have you ever been mocked not because you were wrong, but because your truth made others uncomfortable? They mistook your simplicity for lack. They confused your peace for passivity. But what really bothered them is that you were real in a sea of masks. That scared them. It forced them to look at their own illusions, and they didn't want to. So, what did they do? They tried to diminish you. They rolled their eyes at your journey. They gossiped, giggled, and tried to clown the very thing they secretly admired. But mocking can't change mantle. Laughing can't remove anointing. As 1 Samuel 16:7 declares, people look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And God saw yours. That's why he sent you. Think of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. Soft-spoken, simple, gentle. Many mocked him for being too nice. But his program changed the psychological and emotional lives of generations. Or look at Mother Teresa, frail, quiet, unimpressive in the world's eyes, but spiritually, she was a lion. Her presence broke strongholds in the darkest corners of poverty. She didn't shout, she served. Her actions outranked entire armies. Or consider Chadwick Boseman. People judged his thinness during his final days. They didn't know he was battling cancer. While they mocked his appearance, he was working silently to leave behind a legacy of strength and representation. And lastly, take Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a humble theologian during Nazi Germany. He wasn't powerful by status, but his spiritual resistance still echoes today. You weren't sent to fit their mold. You were sent to break it, and they couldn't handle that. They judged your vessel, forgetting that God chooses the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. 1 Corinthians 1:27. They missed the message because they hated the packaging, and now the very things they mocked are the things that scare them. Your peace, now they can't sleep. Your quiet confidence, now they feel exposed. Your simple lifestyle, now they study your every move, trying to decode what they once dismissed. You didn't switch up, you just stayed steady. And over time, your fruit did the talking. As Matthew 7:20 reminds us, thus, by their fruit, you will recognize them. You didn't need to announce your arrival. Your assignment revealed itself. The ranks you walk in are not worn on your chest, they're engraved on your spirit. And they couldn't discern it, not because it wasn't there, but because their spiritual eyes were blind. Chosen one, let them mock, let them laugh, let them pretend. But understand this, spiritual blindness always costs more than pride can afford. And they're paying that price now, not because of you, but because they dishonored what heaven honored. The vessel may not have looked like much to them, but to God, it was chosen, filled, and sent. Number 5. They didn't know heaven recognized you, but now hell does too. Chosen one, for a long time, you moved through this world quietly. You didn't chase the spotlight. You didn't hunger for applause. You weren't looking to be famous, followed, or even understood. All you wanted was to obey, to heal, to grow, to align yourself with the higher calling you felt in your bones. And while others clamored to be seen, you remained hidden, tucked away under God's shadow. But let me ask you this, can something truly remain hidden once heaven decides to reveal it? Your hidden years weren't wasted, they were weaponized. God was sharpening you in secret while others were performing in public. You were being equipped, and yes, people misunderstood you. They dismissed your presence because they couldn't discern your preparation. They thought you were average. They couldn't see the war angels assigned to your name. But now the unveiling has begun, not because you made noise, but because the moment they tested you with wickedness, the spirit realm was alerted. What was once quietly unfolding in the background suddenly came into full view. Did they think they could curse what God already crowned? Did they believe that their gossip could override your divine assignment? The moment they came at you with impure motives, the alarm went off in heaven. And strangely, in hell, too. You were already known in the courts of heaven, but now your name echoes in the halls of darkness, too. You went from quiet contender to confirmed combatant in the spirit. You're no longer just someone. You're a marked vessel. That's why the attacks have escalated. That's why the pressure has increased. Because you're no longer just a theoretical threat. You've been activated, just like Jesus, who for years lived in obscurity, working as a carpenter, walking through villages, unnoticed by kings. But the moment his ministry began, both angels and demons recognized him. In Mark 1:24, a demon cried out, "I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The spiritual realm always knows before the people do. And chosen one, now they know who you are. Look at someone like Sojourner Truth. She was born into slavery, stripped of everything, hidden in the shadows of history. But when her voice rose, when she walked into her anointing, the world shook. She didn't just speak for herself, she spoke for heaven's justice. The same is true for someone like Malala Yousafzai. She was once just a schoolgirl in Pakistan, but when darkness came for her, thinking she was weak, the realm responded. Now her name is known worldwide, because attacks don't silence God's vessels, they amplify them. Or take the example of Tyler Perry. For years he was overlooked, homeless and dismissed. But while the world ignored him, heaven was scripting his rise. Now, even hell knows his name. Or Harriet Tubman, small in stature, soft in voice. But when she moved, realms shifted. She was invisible to many, but unforgettable in the spirit. Demons fled where she walked. So don't wonder anymore why things feel heavier. Don't question why attacks have intensified. It's because you're no longer underestimated in the unseen realm. You are known, you are feared, and the pressure you feel is evidence of your emergence. The realm of darkness is now aware of the authority you carry. Isaiah 61 reminds you of this moment. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. That light has made you visible to forces that once ignored you. But don't be afraid, because if hell now recognizes your name, it means heaven already sealed your identity. The battle is a sign of your elevation, not your undoing. They thought they were just messing with a quiet soul, but what they did was unveil a warrior whose name now carries weight in both realms. One rejoices, the other trembles, and you remain standing not by your strength, but by divine appointment. Number 6, their attacks were actually exams, and you passed them without even knowing. Chosen one, have you ever wondered why the hardest seasons of your life came not from strangers, but from those you trusted most? Why the betrayal felt so surgical? Why the rejection felt like punishment? What if I told you? Those weren't just attacks, they were exams. And every time someone tried to destroy you, God was watching to see if you would stay aligned with your higher self. What if the breaking was actually a test of building? They thought they were tearing you down. Every lie they told, every insult they hurled, every moment they tried to humiliate you was their attempt at control. But what they didn't know is that you were never in their hands. You were in God's. And in His wisdom, He repurposed every malicious move into a curriculum of elevation. Each betrayal was a test. Could you remain loyal to your soul even when others weren't loyal to you? Each rejection was an exam. Would you abandon your purpose to chase their validation? And each moment of backstabbing, it was a test of your purity. Could you keep your hands clean while bleeding? Most people fail tests like these. They turn bitter, they lash out, they become what hurt them. But you didn't fold. Romans 5:3-4 teaches us, we glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. That's exactly what happened to you. What they thought would destroy you only revealed that your character was already refined. While they were celebrating your downfall, heaven was marking you for promotion, and you didn't even know it. Remember Nelson Mandela, decades in prison, humiliated, isolated, but what the world called suffering, God called preparation. When he walked out, he didn't seek vengeance, he led a nation. Or look at Bethany Hamilton, the surfer whose arm was taken by a shark. They thought she was done, but she came back stronger, proving resilience in front of millions. Or Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor who lost everything, yet birthed one of the most profound books in human history, Man's Search for Meaning. His pain didn't break him, it transformed him. Even consider Beyoncé, publicly mocked during early failures, overlooked by the industry. But she used every attack as an opportunity to evolve. What people thought would weaken her only sharpened her. The same is true for you, chosen one. Their cruelty created your curriculum, and while they were plotting your end, God was promoting your next level. You didn't need to prove your worth. Your endurance proved it for you. 2 Corinthians 4:17 reminds us, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." Your trials were not just temporary, they were transformative. And now, what haunts them most isn't your survival, it's your evolution. The version of you they attacked isn't even here anymore. That version died in the fire. The one standing now is reborn through fire, with clarity in your eyes and heaven behind your name. You didn't just pass their test, you outgrew the classroom entirely. So remember this, they never had power over your destiny. They were tools in the process, nothing more, and without realizing it, they helped usher you into the very authority they tried to deny you. Number 7, they underestimated you because their spirits were uninitiated, and now they can't unsee what they overlooked. Chosen one, don't be surprised that they misjudged you. Don't take it personally that they laughed, doubted, or rolled their eyes when you entered the room. The issue wasn't your value, it was their vision. They weren't stupid, they were spiritually uninitiated. They had knowledge, degrees, social awareness, and sharp conversation. But spiritual intelligence? That's earned through the furnace, not books. How can someone recognize divine fire when they've never stood in the flames themselves? What they lacked wasn't intellect, it was initiation. They had never been broken open by God. They had never endured the type of divine pruning that tears your ego apart and builds your spirit from scratch. So when you showed up, humble, calm, authentic, they couldn't comprehend what they were really looking at. You carried peace, and it made them restless. You carried authority, and it made them defensive. Why did your presence trigger people who claimed they were fine? Because you reminded them of everything inside them they were still avoiding. You didn't come in preaching, correcting, or judging, but your anointing did all the talking. Your peace made their internal chaos itch. Your authenticity exposed the masks they were hiding behind. As Proverbs 28:1 says, "The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion." You didn't chase anyone, but they ran from your energy because it demanded truth. They saw someone ordinary, but couldn't explain why their spirit felt unsettled around you. That's because spiritual rank can't be seen, it must be discerned. And discernment comes through spiritual initiation, not status. They didn't see the nights you warred in prayer. They didn't witness the tears you cried in private. They weren't there for the seasons where you bled in silence, forgave without apologies, and remained loyal when no one clapped for you. That's what gave you spiritual rank, not your resume, but your refining. Just like Moses, who once fled into the wilderness for 40 years. People dismissed him as a failure, but God was initiating him in the desert, and when he returned, they still judged him by his past. But the realm saw his authority. Or like Mary Magdalene, she was discredited by society, yet her devotion made her the first to witness the resurrection. People judged her surface. God saw her spirit. Or consider Jim Carrey, often misunderstood because of his humor, later dismissed for his introspective interviews. But beneath the surface, he carried deep spiritual insight most people weren't prepared to hear. Or Cassandra Peterson, known for her role as Elvira, yet privately a survivor of abuse, cancer, and transformation. The vessel confused many, but the depth was earned through pain. So when they tried to size you up by appearance, background, or demeanor, they weren't wrong logically, they were blind spiritually. They mistook your stillness for lack of force. They mocked your simplicity because they thought true power must be loud. But as 1 Corinthians 2:14 reminds us, the person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, They are discerned only through the Spirit. Their rejection of you wasn't about who you are. It was a reflection of what their spirit hasn't yet been trained to recognize. You weren't there to be liked. You were there to shift atmospheres. You didn't need performance. You were carrying presence. And in doing so, you showed them something they weren't ready for. A soul unbothered by trends, ego, or fear. So when they treated you like a threat instead of a teacher, they exposed their immaturity. Their resistance wasn't about your actions, it was about your authenticity. Because you're not just another voice, you're a vessel for something holy, disruptive, and untamable. Number 8, you didn't have to curse them, you just had to survive them. Chosen one, sometimes the most powerful move you'll ever make is to walk away whole. You didn't have to argue. You didn't have to drag anyone publicly. You didn't have to clap back with receipts, revenge, or retaliation. You just had to survive. And for a chosen one, survival isn't a passive act. It's spiritual warfare. It's victory in disguise. It's divine testimony that says, I'm still here, and that's enough. They expected you to fall apart. They wanted to see you fold, snap, become bitter, or break character. They wanted to call you the villain while provoking you to act like one, but instead of feeding the fire, you walked through it and came out glowing. You didn't match their energy, you kept yours sacred, and now, without ever cursing them, your survival became their judgment. Psalm 23:5 says, You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You didn't have to fight for the table. You just kept showing up even when you had no seat. And now, they're watching you eat. They're watching your peace grow. And it's haunting them. You didn't call them out, but your glow exposed them. You didn't wish them harm, but your healing showed how powerless they really were. Because what's more damning than seeing someone you tried to destroy still thriving? What's more terrifying than realizing all your manipulation, lies, and sabotage did nothing to dim their light? Your silence, once mocked, is now screaming truth. Your peace, once dismissed, is now radiating through every space you enter. You didn't break, you bloomed, and that alone has dismantled every lie they told about you. How can they say you were weak when you survived what they couldn't? How can they claim you were the problem when you're still walking in peace while they're unraveling? Just like Job, who lost everything, suffered endlessly, but never cursed God. His friends misunderstood his silence, but his endurance spoke louder than any defense. And in the end, God restored him double. Or Malcolm X, demonized in his time, but history has revealed the purity of his mission. He didn't curse his critics. His legacy outlived their slander. Or consider Monica Lewinsky. Once globally shamed and silenced, she didn't retaliate, but rebuilt her voice with grace and intelligence. Now she speaks truth where gossip once reigned. Or Louis Zamperini, tortured in World War II, but forgave his captors and inspired millions. His peace was his justice. Romans 12:21 says, Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's exactly what you did. You didn't hex them, you didn't harm them, you outlived the narrative, and in doing so, you triggered a spiritual backlash, not because of curses, but because of truth. Every time they see you, their lies lose oxygen. Every time you smile in peace, their chaos deepens. Why? Because your presence now reflects what they tried to suppress. Undeniable resilience. You didn't destroy them. They exposed themselves, and your only weapon was survival. They thought they were testing your emotions, but they were testing God's patience. And heaven didn't need to raise its voice. It simply waited for your fruit to speak. Galatians 6:9 says, Let us not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. And now, chosen one, your harvest is revealing everything. They're not haunted by your words, they're haunted by your strength, and that strength wasn't loud. It was holy, quiet, solid, and still standing. Number 9. You triggered their judgment because you carried what they tried to steal in the spirit. Chosen one, what they envied wasn't your clothes, your voice, your income, or your charisma. It was your spiritual weight. It was the authority you didn't announce. It was the shift in the atmosphere every time you entered a space, even when you said nothing. It was the divine force behind your calm. And here's the truth. They didn't want to become you. They wanted to bypass the process you endured and still take your power. Have you ever noticed how people tried to copy you but couldn't carry what you carry? That's because this mantle wasn't handed to you. It was pressed out of you. It was forged in silence, isolation, obedience, and battle. You weren't shaped on stages. You were shaped in the shadows. They saw your glow but didn't stay to witness your grind. They envied your presence but had no appetite for your process. They wanted the crown without the cross. But in the kingdom, that's not how it works. Think of David. He was anointed in private before anyone respected him in public. He fought lions and bears in secret before he faced Goliath in front of a crowd. That's the pattern. Psalm 66:10 says, "For you, God, tested us. You refined us like silver." What makes you valuable is what you endured, not what you inherited. So when they tried to mimic you, they weren't just copying your style. They were trespassing against something sacred. They wanted the influence, but not the isolation. They wanted the oil, but not the crushing, and heaven saw it. Because in the spirit, there is no plagiarism without consequence. What they tried to impersonate was never up for sale. That's why their plans are unraveling. That's why they're battling chaos, confusion, and backlash. They stepped into a frequency that required a sacrifice they never made. You, on the other hand, paid in tears, blood, prayers, and silence. Your oil was not bought. It was earned through obedience when it would have been easier to rebel. Look at someone like Chadwick Boseman. While others tried to emulate his excellence, no one knew he was battling cancer in silence. His strength wasn't showy, it was sacred. Or Corrie ten Boom, who survived the Holocaust and emerged not with bitterness, but a powerful global message of forgiveness. She didn't ask for attention, she asked for alignment. Or Gugu Mbatha-Raw, an actress who chooses roles with spiritual and emotional depth, even when it means bypassing fame. And even Elijah McCoy, the inventor whose designs were so unmatched. Imitators were dismissed with the phrase, "the real McCoy," because counterfeit can only go so far. So when they tried to carry what you carry without paying the price, they triggered divine judgment, not because you asked for revenge, but because the spirit realm always protects what is holy. Hebrews 5:4 tells us, "No one takes this honor upon himself, but he receives it when called by God." You didn't call yourself chosen, you were called. And when they tried to replicate your rank without surviving your fire, heaven responded. They weren't just stealing a look, they were violating an order. They thought your authority was built on charisma, but it was blood-bought obedience. They didn't realize the spirit realm isn't impressed by mimicry. It responds only to authenticity. That's why their plans collapsed. That's why they're haunted. Because they tried to dethrone someone who wasn't even on a throne, but on assignment. And when you are assigned, trying to replace you becomes not just rebellion, it becomes spiritual perjury. They weren't mocking you, they were mocking the God who sent you. And now they're paying the spiritual price for impersonating what they were never anointed to carry. Number 10. You didn't come with a crown, you came with an assignment. Chosen one, they expected royalty to show up in gold robes and grand entrances. But you came wrapped in silence, dressed in humility, and walking with unseen weight. That's why they underestimated you. They didn't realize that heaven's leaders don't always wear crowns. They carry assignments. You weren't sent here for applause. You were sent here for alignment. You didn't show up for validation. You showed up to enforce divine order. Have you ever noticed how the room shifts when you walk in, even if you say nothing? That's not charisma, it's clearance. You carry a license to disrupt darkness. You don't need a stage to shift atmospheres. That's why spirits move when you enter the building. That's why people feel uneasy around you, even if you're polite. Because your presence announces something they didn't prepare for. They thought you were average because you didn't seek attention. They mistook your quiet nature for passivity. But spiritual power isn't in volume, it's in jurisdiction. It's about what you're authorized to move, bind, release, and shift. As Matthew 18:18 says, "Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." That's not poetry, that's spiritual governance. Look at Harriet Tubman. She didn't have a title, she had an assignment. She was small, silent, underestimated, and yet she shifted history with divine authority. Or Fred Hampton, only 21 years old when he led a revolutionary movement rooted in justice and unity. They underestimated him until it was too late. Or Wangari Maathai, an environmental warrior who began with trees and ended up reshaping political power in Kenya. Or even Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who wasn't loud, but his quiet resistance shook spiritual foundations in Nazi Germany. Chosen one, you're not loud because you don't have to be. You don't prove who you are. The realm already recognizes your walk. That's why some people hated you without cause. That's why strangers resisted you without reason. Because their demons picked up on your authority before their minds did. You didn't need to shout. You didn't need to wear a title. You weren't sent to be adored. You were sent to disrupt cycles, shatter illusions, and restore divine order. You weren't crowned by man. You were commissioned by God. And that's why you confuse them. You carry fire, but not rage. You carry weight, but not ego. You bring stillness, but not stagnation. When people finally felt your power, it was too late. You had already shifted the room. The atmosphere had already responded. The healing had already begun. The truth had already stirred. Because you weren't sent to impress. You were sent to reform. And heaven doesn't wait for applause to move. Isaiah 61:1 confirms your call. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives. That's your purpose. That's your mantle. And it has nothing to do with looking powerful. It has everything to do with being faithful. So no, you didn't wear a crown, but you wore obedience. And in the kingdom, that's all the authority you'll ever need. Number 11. They tried to dominate someone who wrestled with angels and lived. Chosen one. Have you ever noticed how confidently people try to test you, thinking you're unseasoned? They throw shade, manipulate conversations, or try to embarrass you, believing you're soft, passive, or naive. But what they didn't know is that you've wrestled with angels in the dark, and you came out with more than just survival. You came out with strategy. They assumed they were fighting a beginner, but in truth, they picked a battle with someone who's already endured wars they couldn't survive even in their imagination. How do you explain your peace to people who've never walked through spiritual fire? You don't. You let your scars do the talking. You let your silence unsettle them. Because while they were polishing their pride in public, you were negotiating with heaven for your very sanity behind closed doors. You weren't scrolling. You were weeping. You weren't gossiping. You were warring. And every time you could have given up, but didn't, your spiritual rank increased. Just like Jacob in Genesis 32:24 through 30. He wrestled all night with the angel, not for fame, not for validation, for a blessing, and came out with a limp and a new name. Chosen one, that's you. You didn't just make it through. You were marked by the fight. And when they came at you thinking they could manipulate or overpower you, they triggered a legacy they weren't spiritually licensed to confront. They were dancing with devils you already defeated. They tried to insult your name, not knowing you already laid it on the altar. You didn't flinch when they mocked you because you've sat in deeper silence, endured heavier rejection, and stood your ground in darker nights than they've ever known. Have you ever realized that their loudness is only frightening to those who've never survived silence? But you did. You faced the abyss and still emerged with light in your eyes. Take someone like Nelson Mandela, confined, misunderstood, labeled, but within those walls he sharpened his vision. Or Helen Keller, who lived without sight or hearing, yet changed how the world views limitations. Or Maya Moore, the WNBA superstar who paused her career at its peak to fight for justice. She didn't need applause, she needed alignment. And Elie Wiesel, who emerged from the horrors of Auschwitz with wisdom, not bitterness. These are souls who came back from spiritual valleys with flame in their step and clarity in their hearts. That's who they were confronting when they tested you. Not someone random, not someone fragile, but someone who has negotiated survival with heaven and lived to carry fire, not for revenge, but for purpose. Isaiah 40, Danantafur. Tutatasi, promises. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. That verse was your testimony before they even opened their mouths. They assumed they could play you, but heaven doesn't allow games near its warriors. They triggered something they couldn't explain. They felt the pushback in the spirit, even if they laughed in the natural. And the truth is, you weren't reacting, you were discerning. Their antics didn't shake you because you fought worse and stayed standing. And now they've realized, you're not just someone with experience, you're someone anointed through endurance. You didn't get here by accident, you were carved out of agony. And when they poked, hoping to provoke, they met someone they were never ready to encounter, a survivor with fire in their eyes and heaven in their step. Number 12. They called you arrogant, but it was authority they couldn't understand. Chosen one, they didn't label you arrogant because of anything you said. It wasn't your tone, it wasn't your posture, it was your presence. They sensed something unshakable in you, something that didn't flinch when ignored or shrink when criticized, and it made them uncomfortable. And what people don't understand, they label. They couldn't decode your calm confidence, so they called it pride. But what they were really responding to wasn't arrogance, it was authority. Have you noticed how simply existing in your truth upsets those who are still hiding from theirs? You didn't try to dominate the room, you just entered it without asking permission to be. You didn't beg for a seat at the table. You brought your own spiritual weight and made the atmosphere acknowledge it. Real authority doesn't yell. It doesn't need applause. It's not rooted in performance. It's rooted in presence, and presence is earned through fire. Your groundedness wasn't ego. It was forged in obedience. You weren't trying to shine. You just refused to dim, and that's what provoked them. In Luke 4:32, it's written, "They were amazed at his teaching because his words had authority." Jesus didn't perform, he carried truth. That's what you do. You don't walk in pride, you walk in clarity. But people who depend on external validation interpret that as threat, because they've never built anything in silence, never buried ego to uncover identity. So your confidence, it felt like confrontation to them. Think of Michelle Obama, poised, unapologetic, radiant in her identity, yet often called arrogant by those intimidated by her presence. Or Simone Biles, whose excellence in gymnastics made people uncomfortable, not because she bragged, but because her talent couldn't be denied. Or Malala Yousafzai, who speaks with simplicity, but every word carries power because it's rooted in real experience, not ambition. Or C.S. Lewis, whose intellectual and spiritual authority still offends those who prefer shallow thinking. That's the thing about chosen ones. You shine even when you try not to, not because of spotlight, but because your soul radiates something deeper, something rooted, something real. And when others haven't done the inner work, your light feels like an indictment. Your certainty was not arrogance, it was activation. You didn't come to compete, you came to complete your assignment. And while they were offended by your stillness, heaven was smiling at your clarity. John 7:16 reminds us, "My teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me." That's how you move, not on your own, but in alignment with something far greater. They expected you to apologize for your confidence, but you had nothing to apologize for. You weren't arrogant, you were done shrinking. You were no longer willing to pretend you were less just to make others feel more. And that refusal to self-sabotage offended people who were still addicted to performance. The truth is, they weren't reacting to you. They were reacting to what your existence revealed about themselves. You reminded them of the work they still haven't done. You reminded them of the courage they haven't yet claimed. And rather than grow, they chose to criticize. But chosen one, keep walking, keep speaking, keep showing up, because God didn't form you to be hidden under someone else's comfort. You were formed to be a mirror, a fire, a shift. And if they're offended by that, it's not your problem. It's their invitation to grow, if they're ready. Number 13, they were playing chess, but you've already seen the whole board. Chosen one, they thought they were being clever. They believed they could corner you with tactics, sneak around with gossip, or outthink you with schemes crafted in secret. They mistook your stillness for naivety, your silence for cluelessness. But what they didn't realize is that you weren't confused, you were consecrated, and you weren't just playing the game, you were seated at the table with the one who designed the board. Have you ever sensed betrayal before it showed its face? Have you ever smiled through a conversation already knowing the intent behind their words? That's not paranoia. That's discernment. That's what happens when you don't just walk in intelligence. You walk in divine instruction. You're not reacting. You're receiving insight from above. They thought you were playing checkers while they played chess. But the truth is, you were listening to heaven's strategy. Psalm 37:23 reminds us, "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his way." That's why your steps never matched their predictions. You weren't outwitted, you were divinely rerouted, and every pit they dug became their own grave. Every trap was turned into a testimony. Look at Harriet Jacobs. She outsmarted slave catchers for 7 years by hiding in a crawl space no higher than 9 inches, strategizing not with rage, but with patience and divine resolve. Or Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose pen in Uncle Tom's Cabin ignited a movement. They didn't understand her strategy until it was too late. Even in modern history, whistleblowers like Edward Snowden saw the board differently. Not because they were reckless, but because they could see beneath the game. And remember Joseph. His brothers thought they'd cornered him by selling him into slavery, but Joseph saw the whole board. Genesis 50:20 confirms this truth. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done. That's divine chess. That's strategy backed by foresight. So when they tried to box you in, you didn't panic. You pivoted. You let heaven move you like a piece already predestined to win. They thought betrayal would break you, but it became a bridge. They thought sabotage would delay you, but it accelerated your growth. Every false accusation was just another step closer to your activation. And now, the same ones who plotted in secret are dealing with confusion. Their blueprints crumbled, their alliances fractured, because the moment they played against a chosen one, they entered a game they were never anointed to win. You weren't just wise, you were walking in covenant. That's why you didn't have to defend yourself. You let the Spirit rearrange the entire board. Proverbs 3:5-6 echoes your strategy. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. He will make your paths straight. Your peace came not from what you knew, but from who was guiding your every step. They thought they were 5 moves ahead, but heaven was already 20 moves beyond their reach. You don't play games, you establish dominion. That's why every time they tried to ensnare you, they ended up ensnaring themselves. You were never outnumbered, you were never outmatched. You were simply instructed by a realm they couldn't comprehend. They didn't understand how you kept winning, but now they realize you were never moving alone. Number 14. Now they fear you, not because you're dangerous, but because you're divinely backed. Chosen one, they weren't afraid of you at first. And how could they be? You didn't come in loud. You weren't boastful. You didn't declare your authority in the open. In fact, you looked ordinary, unbothered, peaceful. They mistook that for passivity. They saw your silence and thought it meant vulnerability. But here's the revelation. Your lack of noise wasn't emptiness. It was evidence. Evidence of someone so deeply backed by heaven that you didn't need to lift a finger for the war to begin. Have you ever watched people switch up the moment they realized you were spiritually covered? That fear isn't about intimidation, it's about realization. Realization that what they touched wasn't just a person, but a realm. Just like Elisha in 2 Kings 6:17, when he prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." And the servant suddenly saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire surrounding them. That's what's backing you. And when they came for you, thinking they were just coming for a person, they had no idea they were provoking a realm filled with heavenly hosts. Now doors are slamming in their face. Peace has fled from their lives. Unseen patterns of chaos trail behind them, not because you cursed them, but because they trespassed into sacred space. Your life is consecrated. Your silence is saturated in covenant. You didn't need to threaten. You simply remained still, and heaven did the rest. Look at Florence Nightingale. She didn't walk with arrogance, but her presence reformed global healthcare, quiet, firm, unwavering. Or Franz Jägerstätter, the Austrian farmer who refused to pledge loyalty to Hitler, even unto death. The divine covered his legacy. Or Ida B. Wells, who exposed injustice in silence-breaking clarity. And even Fred Hampton, who carried vision that unsettled systems, not through aggression, but through conviction. People tremble around you now, not because you changed, but because their spiritual eyes finally opened. You didn't just survive, you flourished. You didn't retaliate, you elevated, and heaven made sure they saw it. Isaiah 54:17 declares, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper, and every tongue that rises against you in judgment you shall condemn." The weapons didn't work, not because of your hands, but because of your covering. And now, they don't just avoid conflict with you, they avoid your presence altogether, not because they hate you, but because they finally respect what they can't explain. You carry a frequency that convicts the room, a stillness that pierces, a peace that rattles unrested spirits. Let this settle in your spirit. They judged the vessel, but never discerned the rank. They misread your stillness as absence, but it was divine restraint. And when they crossed the line, they touched something holy. That's why their chaos amplified. That's why the whisper of your name now stirs anxiety in their camp. You weren't activated by ego. You were assigned through fire. Every hardship, every betrayal, every spiritual death and rebirth, those were your qualifications. And now, without announcing it, you've become a living revelation. not because you cursed them, but because your life exposes what vengeance never could. Romans 8:31 ends the matter. If God is for us, who can be against us? That truth is now undeniable, and those who once laughed at you, they speak your name with caution, not because you threaten, but because you're backed, covered, untouchable. Chosen one, if this message stirred something deep within your spirit, it's because it was meant for you. It wasn't just words, it was confirmation. You are not who they thought you were, and truthfully, you're not even who you used to be. You've grown through fire, risen through silence, and carried a weight that cannot be copied or explained. What they tried to play with, heaven had already sealed. What they misjudged, God already qualified. So walk forward now, not with hesitation but with holy clarity. You weren't just preserved, you were prepared. And now the time has come for you to walk fully into everything heaven ordained. Not halfway, not apologetically, but with bold, unshakable authority. Thank you so much for walking through this message with me. Whether you're returning or you just found this space, I'm honored that your spirit connected here. You didn't land here by accident. This space was created with you in mind, for those who've been misunderstood, underestimated, and spiritually forged behind closed doors. Thank you for your presence, for your energy, for your listening heart. Every time you show up here, you're not just receiving, you're aligning. You're confirming your place among the ones God set apart from the beginning. If you feel led to support this work, you can do so through the Super Thanks feature. It's a way to pour back into a space that's pouring into you. But please hear this clearly. Whether you donate or not, I'm truly and deeply grateful for you. Your support through watching, sharing, commenting, praying, and being present is powerful in itself. You are appreciated more than you know. If this word resonated, don't leave quietly. Share this with someone who's been silently fighting battles, walking through valleys, and carrying unseen authority. I pray that from this day forward, the favor of God goes before you like a shield. I pray every attack launched against your purpose falls flat, every lie spoken over your life crumbles, and every delay is replaced with divine acceleration. I speak clarity into your steps, peace into your mind, and strength into your voice. You are not behind. You are being launched. You are not average. You are appointed. And now, everything heaven has written for you will begin to manifest, not in fragments, but in fullness. This is your confirmation. You're not just protected. You're posted. You're not just surviving. You're reigning. And the ones who once mocked you now speak your name with caution, not because of fear, but because they finally see what God saw all along. You were never here to impress. You were sent to shift. And now that you've been activated, you're walking proof that the oil wasn't wasted, the pain wasn't pointless, and the silence was never empty. Heaven is with you. Keep walking. Keep standing. And above all, keep shining.